Well, today we're going to actually end off our current series called Joy in Relationships. But before we do, I want to talk to you about March just very briefly. We're going to start a series in March called Dealing with Emotions. And the cool thing about this is we're actually going to pull out some emotions that we see in God, that the scriptures talk about, that God displays. How do we become more like God as we express our emotions? And I don't want to tell any more about that except to say that next week the title is called Jesus Crosses Lines, and I'm not going to go any further with that one. I'm going to leave you in suspense, but I'm really excited about that. So let's finish off this series, How to Be Happy in Marriage. How to be happy in marriage. I think it's a question that everybody asks. Pastor, how can I find joy in marriage? How can I be happy in my marriage? Happiness really is a choice. We hear that, and sometimes it's even kind of annoying to hear it because we feel like, well, you know what, it's not. I can't just turn it on and turn it off. But I think there are decisions we can make in our lives that lead us to happiness. And happy couples make the decision to be happy in their marriage. So before we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, let me first of all just give you just a quick insight into what the city of Corinth, or the people in the city of Corinth, how they viewed God. Their view of God was that it was strictly a vertical relationship, that everything was vertical, that it doesn't matter about that person or that person, it's me and God, and I've got to give enough sacrifices, and I've got to do enough things to make him happy so that he'll bless my family, he'll increase my crops, he'll increase my cattle and my sheep, that he will bless me in certain areas. And so it almost felt like the gods were kind of toying with you in that. But Paul brought on a completely different concept. Paul's concept that we see all through the New Testament, and what we're going to look specifically in 1 Corinthians, was actually much different. His concept was, yes, your relationship with God should be vertical and horizontal. Yes, you have to be concerned about your relationship with God vertically. But what Paul began to say is, if your relationship is good with God vertically, it will be manifested by a good relationship horizontally. In other words, we can't say, I love God, but treat people like trash. Can't do that. It's not the way God allowed. As a matter of fact, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, we see something where Peter actually illustrates this point. And by the way, I want to say the illustration that I'm going to say here from 1 Peter 3, you can find it about all kinds of relationships. But we're specifically going to look at having to do with marriage. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. So he's talking to husbands and telling them how they should treat their wives. And treat them with respect as the weaker partner. Then he goes on. And as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, and here's where the key part comes. Ready? So that nothing will hinder your prayers. He's saying if you don't treat her with respect, your prayers to me are actually hindered. It's like a roadblock. There's a hurdle between you and me because you haven't been treating your spouse right. And let me go ahead and say from the outset, this is not just a husband towards a wife. This is also a wife towards a husband. How you treat your spouse matters. And again, Paul writes this about all kinds of relationships, but this specific one talks about marriage. So I want us to understand that it really, really does matter. Now, as we begin to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it's interesting because we love to quote this. We love this. This is the love chapter. We love to quote it in weddings. We love putting it on t-shirts. Love is patient, love is kind. We have posters with it, and it's something that we really believe in. However, there's one part of this that I'm going to read in just a minute that I think really affects our happiness in marriage. It's the choice that you and I have to make. And by the way, all of these things really affect the happiness, but I'm going to key in on one area. Verse 1 of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. He has just come out of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, where he's talking about the gifts of the Spirit, one of those being speaking in tongues, right? It's one of the charismatic gifts that the Scripture talks about. But he says, if you speak in tongues, you have the gift, the miracle of speaking in tongues, but you don't have love. He said, you're just making noise. That's it. Notice this. Notice this. He says you have to have love. Love is something towards one another. It's not vertical necessarily. It's also horizontal. Look at verse 2. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. By the way, this is really interesting because we make the assumption that because somebody can quote lots of scripture, because they have read a lot of Christian books or they've been in the faith a very long time, that makes them spiritually mature. And that's just not the case. He says a mark, not the only mark, but a mark of spiritual maturity is love. He says if you can quote all the scripture, you have all kinds of knowledge of the Bible. You can quote all scripture. You can give all the kings in chronological order in the Bible, all of these things, but you don't have love. He says it's worth nothing. Verse 3 says, if I give all possessions to the poor, in other words, if I give to kingdom builders, and if I give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. I do all of these great exploits, but I don't have love, it's worth nothing. Then we get into the part that we really love to quote here. He says in verse 4, love is patient, love is kind. We know this to be true. There's a patience and a kindness that's important. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. And we agree with all of these things. There's a patience that we have to have towards our spouse. There's a kindness. We don't want to envy. We don't want to boast. We don't want to be proud. We talked about this last week, that pride will destroy a relationship. Humility has to be the way that we come at any relationship. Verse 5 says, it does not dishonor others. Saying if you love your spouse, you're not going to dishonor them. You're going to honor them. It doesn't dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. A godly biblical relationship is not looking, what can I get for myself? It's trying to figure out, how can I bless my spouse? How can I outserve my spouse? How can I drop the rope and let go of my own hopes and expectations? It is not easily angered. Really important. It keeps no record of wrongs. Wondering today, just very briefly, before we move on from that, if I ask you for a list of things that your spouse always messes up on, things that just irk you, is it right there in front of your mind? Verse 6 says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. And these are going to become really important scriptures here. Does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is the secret to our choice of having a happy relationship. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. So I said that always trusting is that choice that we have to make that becomes the secret to having a great relationship. In the Greek, this word that's used here in trust means to believe everything. And that's scary to us because we're taught, don't go and believe everything. You're going to be taken advantage of. If you go into a relationship saying, I don't want to be taken advantage of, then you're going to go into a relationship doomed to fail, or at very best, not live with complete happiness and joy. He says we should always trust. It becomes our default habit. Because here's the thing, in every relationship, at some point there is going to be a gap in what we expect and what we experience. There's going to be something that we expect, and then there's going to be something that we experience, and there's going to be a gap between them. So think about it. We have certain expectations. Maybe it's, you said you're going to be home at 5:30 p.m. today because we're going to have dinner together. I've worked out everything. I've got the kids coming home from soccer practice. I've got everything. I've got to do this because this way I can get them to youth group in time. That's the expectation. I want my kid to grow in their faith. I want them to grow, so I want to have them in youth group in time, so 5:30, right? I want them to have relationship with other youth and experience God. So that's the expectation, right? 5:30 p.m. Yes, that's what it's going to be. And guess what? 6 o'clock rolls around, and then 6:15, and the experience that we have had does not match the expectation. We have an expectation, but the experience is different, and now there's this gap. The gap between what I've expected and what I've experienced. And at that time, we have to make a decision. We have to determine, what am I going to do? Am I going to expect the best out of their explanation, that when they are not home yet and I'm waiting, am I saying, I know they love me, I know they love my kid, and they're wanting to be in youth group too, and I'm not going to assume the worst. I'm going to expect the best right now. I'm going to assume that they probably got held up somewhere. Are we going to expect the best, or are we going to assume the worst? Whether we expect the best or assume the worst may be more important than our expectations and the experience and the gap that's created. In other words, the choice that we fill in may be more important than the gap that they have created. We tend to make these choices, whether to assume the worst or expect the best. We tend to make these choices without realizing that, here I go, I have a choice one way or the other. We just go with the way we're feeling. Happy couples habitually choose to believe the best. Matter of fact, I heard of a really cool study. It was taken over a period of 20 years from people from the United States, from Canada, and from Europe. They looked at them over 20 years, and they found the ones that were happy, that could honestly say that they just lived a blissful, wonderful, happy life. And when they went to this study, they found these couples that were happy, and they made the assumption that the ones who were happy must have lowered their expectations so that it was easier to get to. Therefore, the experience did not create a gap in between. So they made the assumption that happy couples don't lift the bar up high anymore. They don't expect much. That way, they can be happy. What they found was actually the opposite. What they found was that over 20 years, happy couples actually raised their level of expectations, and their partner's experience closed the gap, and met their expectations. And as they went through this, they found that these happy couples tended to rate their partners ahead of themselves as far as how good they were as being a spouse. Matter of fact, they said they called it an unrealistically positive view. They went on to say they seemed blind to their flaws. And I know you're probably listening to this and going, I don't want to be blind to anything. But watch what happens here, because I think what we're going to see is that this hits the 1 Corinthians 13, and it really shapes how your marriage goes. They said it created what they called an upward spiral of love. And they put it in 4 different parts. The first one was this. They said they started out with an illusion. In other words, they trusted unconditionally. They just said, I'm going to trust my partner, even if it feels like that they kept doing the same thing wrong. And by the way, in this study, they found that the mistakes that the partner kept making were not any different than the mistakes that were being made with other couples who were not deemed as happy couples. In other words, they had the same problems. But one always trusted, gave the benefit of the doubt, and it created an illusion in their mind. And because they had this illusion in their mind, that created conviction. They became convinced that I'm sure there's a reason why my spouse is late coming home for dinner. I'm not going to assume the worst. I'm going to assume the best. I'm going to expect the best out of them. Illusion created conviction, and then that conviction led to security. Because they really believed this, they felt good in their relationship. It brought a joy in their relationship. And then security fostered intimacy. Because they felt secure with that person, they wanted to be close to them. They wanted to talk to them. They enjoyed spending time with each other. And then intimacy fostered deeper love. And guess what happened when they had deeper love? Deeper love created a greater illusion, which created more conviction, and this upward spiral of love continued over the 20 years. I'm not asking you to live in La La Land and not really see what's going on with your spouse. Some of you are looking at this and you're saying, I could never do this. I can't believe you're even asking this, Pastor, and if you knew my spouse. Some of you are saying, if I do that, then I'm going to get taken advantage of. Notice what's wrong about that statement. I. Happy couples don't look at it as I. Remember in the beginning when we said your hopes and dreams go back in the box? Because it's not about you. How can you fulfill their hopes and dreams? Here it is. Because happy couples don't allow themselves to think about I. They think about you. They think, how can I bless and how can I love my spouse to a greater degree? But again, I want to say, I'm not asking you to live a farce. I'm not asking you to pretend that everything's okay when it's not. So really, the conversation, if I'm supposed to be home at 5:30, I get home at 6:15, could go much differently. If somebody is going to expect the best, they're going to say, hey, how was your day? Hey, by the way, I think you said you're going to be home at 5:30. At 6:15, we're really going to have to hurry, and the food's going to be cold. Can we talk about this a little bit later? I want to make sure that we don't keep doing this and miscommunicating. That right there sets the tone of, I see what's happening. We're going to discuss it, but I refuse to walk into this angry. Now, if somebody's going to assume the worst, I come home at 6:15. My wife is there saying, you did it again. You're always late. You're making the kids late to youth group. The food is cold. You always do this, and it's not fair. You see the difference that's there. And by the way, the same thing goes for the other spouse. Either way. It can go from men to women or women to men. Either way. But the difference of what's happening here is the environment that we're creating in the home. If I come home and my spouse says, why are you always late? You always do these things. It makes me say, I'm either going in for a fight or I'm running away from a fight. But when the spouse says, hey, I'm sure there was something that held you up, but can we just talk about it to make sure that we get on the same page and we don't keep doing this? What that has shown is a level of respect, but also dealing with the issue, and it makes me want to lean into it because I wasn't degraded in the process. And we tend to falter in one of those areas. Now, there are obstacles that really come our way, and we know what they are. By and large, they're usually what we experience. We say, well, this person is always screwing up. It's what we experience. Or it's who we are. Sometimes it's not always the experience they gave to us, but what we've experienced growing up. It's who we are. We watched a mom or dad come up short and not close the gap between expectations and experience. And so we assume that about our spouse, or we've seen it in friends, or we've watched it enough on television that now we're just assuming everything about our spouse as well. What we have to do is to make sure that we're making the right choice. Expect the best. That's trusting. That's always trusting. And that's a choice. But this is a choice, and it's a choice you can make to a happy, fulfilling relationship. By the way, someone had a quote, and I love what they said. They said, suspicion is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you spend your life assuming and suspecting the worst about your spouse, you'll get it. Same thing with your children. If you tell your children you're a failure, you'll never make it in life, most of the time, they won't. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, if we look at our children and we say, you know what, I see something in you. You can do this. And I'm behind you and I pray for you. God's uniquely gifted you and I know you can do this. That child will rise to the occasion and give everything he or she has trying to get there. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same thing happens with our spouse. And we forget that. We forget that we are still human beings dealing with the same issues internally as our children. Also think about this. When you begin to assume the worst, you're creating, again, that environment. Because when somebody expects you to mess up, you're walking on eggshells. You normally do. They're expecting it. They're looking for it. And if you have low trust, you'll create that environment. Now, if we want to expect the best and have trust, let's look back at verse 6 and 7 again and look at this in the light of what we've just talked about. Love does not delight in evil. Can I put this in my terms after what we've talked about today? Love doesn't say, gotcha, I knew you would be late. I caught you. But it rejoices with the truth. When we've said it in a good way, when we have created a good environment, and the spouse says, I'm sorry, I know I said I'd be home earlier. My bad. You know what? Yeah, we can talk about it. Let me get my son or daughter to youth group, and then we can discuss it. But I certainly want to take care of it. You know what happens? It rejoices with truth. You know what comes from there? You know what? It's cold supper, but I appreciate you saying that sincerely. Cold supper, I'll take that any day if we can just have that conversation. Thank you for being honest with me. Guess what happens next time? Honesty becomes what is normal. It starts creating the norm in them. Love isn't trying to catch each other in a problem or building a case against someone. And verse 7 says this, it always protects. A loving spouse, a loving relationship, someone who cares about a loving relationship says, I choose to create the right environment because I don't want to tear my spouse down, even if I don't think that they're doing things the way I want them to do. Even if they're not meeting my expectations. If there's a gap here between expectations and experience, I'm not going to tear them down. I'm going to protect who they are. And then our two words here, always trusts. It always trusts. Always hopes. Always hoping and believing for the best. And then always perseveres. And what I like about this is working under the assumption that there's a need to persevere. In other words, it's implying that there is doubt because of the past. And think about this. Isn't this what you would want for your children? Would you talk to your son or daughter before they get married and say, hey, whatever you do, right from the beginning of the marriage, I want you to trap them in stuff so that you can catch them? You wouldn't. You'd say, no, you need to protect them. You need to trust them. You need to hope and persevere in everything. Why do we tell our kids that, but we don't live that out ourselves? So, when you have expectations and your spouse does not meet those expectations, with good experience. You have a choice. They've created a gap. What you put in the gap sends the marriage on a trajectory to be happy or not. And it all comes down to this. Are you going to expect the best, create the environment of joy in the home, or are you going to assume the worst? You ask for this is how they respond, but you choose what goes in the middle. So we have a little bit of homework this week. We've had it each week, and we'll call that What's the Point? And the point out of all of this is to choose to believe the best. Remember that the gap that your spouse has created between your expectations and the experience that they give you may not be as important as whether you expect the best or you assume the worst. My prayer for all of us is that we expect the best. When we do that, we create an environment in the home. And that is a very simple but difficult thing to obtain, but it will create a happy home. God bless you. Thank you so much for watching this today. I look forward to having you in our March series. Hope you'll be able to worship with us. God bless.